He laughed first. It was the kind of laugh that made the room tilt. Deep, neat, practiced. The sound of a man who had measured the world in margins and found himself comfortably above them. Mauricio Santillana stood at the glass wall of his corner office and let the sound ripple down into the floor below, where people in suits stopped typing and turned their heads. Light from the skyline slid across his wristwatch. He held a champagne flute because the group was celebrating a quarter with record profits, because numbers had always been proof, because he liked the small authority of celebratory gestures. Below, in the service corridor that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old coffee, an 11-year-old named Mateo kept his head down and pushed a cart of empty glass bottles. His uniform was patched and the sneakers were a size too small. His knees had a permanent grit from the playground near his apartment. He moved with the economy of someone who had learned, early and thoroughly, that time saved was trouble averted. When Mateo glanced up, because he could never resist the impossible geometry of windows and the way light made cities look like machines, he saw Mauricio, and he saw laughter. A circle of faces turned toward a curious object, a small, portable safe sitting like a dark stone on Mauricio's polished desk. The safe arrived on a rainy Thursday, wrapped in a plain cardboard crate that seemed ridiculous against the chrome and glass. A courier had handed it to Mauricio's assistant, and then lingered, as if he knew he was leaving something that would not only test locks. Inside was a note in careful handwriting, an inheritance, to be opened only by solving the puzzles engraved on the device. Mauricio liked puzzles when they proved a point, when intellect, training, and the right consultants could be marshaled to prove superiority. He set it in the middle of the conference table and announced, with the theater he kept for announcements, that this would be a demonstration of excellence. "Bring me the best," he said. "Let us see who among us can claim a claim to brilliance." Word spread fast through corridors like a heady rumor. In the service wing that smelled of lemon and used soap, Mateo kept toward the back, his mind cataloging cartoons and the little arithmetic book his teacher had given him. He had a habit of carrying scraps of paper folded into tiny packets and tucking them into the seams of his shirt. Prime numbers scribbled with a pencil stub, a halting attempt at the Fibonacci sequence, a list of perfect squares annotated with a child's circled favorites. He had no grand ambitions. He loved numbers the way some children love trees, quietly, insistently, as if they were friends who would always be there. When the safe appeared, he felt a small, familiar thrill, the same shiver of recognition he had the first time the teacher drew a number pattern on the chalkboard, and he saw the order behind it. In the executive suite, consultants arrived with leather portfolios and glossy proposals. They poked at the safe's matte black face and tapped its tiny screen. The company's best minds argued and disagreed. Mauricio watched with that predator's patience. He loved being the test master. He loved how the room leaned on him for the sanction of judgment. He loved, too, the way people lowered themselves in the presence of money and authority. When one consultant suggested a brute force algorithm, Mauricio smiled the short, private smile of someone who knew resources could muscle anything. But as the hours ticked and the safe remained obstinately silent, the smile thinned. What if it's not about brute force? A woman in the back, Carolina, his assistant, murmured later, and her voice was the small, honest thing in the room. Don Alberto, an old accountant with a shock of silver hair, took off his glasses and explained patterns the way he spoke of budgets, careful, almost tender. Look for marks, look for repetition. Sometimes the simplest sequence hides the only key. They tried pressure plates, sequence tests, even dismantling tools that left thin scratch marks like worried veins on the casing. Nothing triggered the safe's tiny speaker. Mauricio's patience ran hot. By the time the board wandered in, he had moved from amusement to irritation. The safe had become a private affront. Back in his neighborhood, Mateo scrubbed the floor of a small cafeteria where his mother, Rosa, worked the morning shift. Rosa had a hands-on fierceness that warmed the alley by sunrise. She folded shirts with the same deliberation she used to fold Mateo's bandaged knees after playground skirmishes. His father, Carlos, sold candy at the bus stop and had a cough that sat heavy in the evenings. They worked double shifts, and they celebrated small things: a rice that didn't stick, a bus that arrived on time, a teacher who said, "He will go far." They believed in the weight of work and the dignity of it. They had taught Mateo that pride was not in the shine of a person's shoes, but in the sturdiness of their hands. Mateo kept his tiny packet of number scraps in the seam of his shirt, even as he swept under the long table where the executives' lunches left crumbs. He watched the safe from the glass doors that separated the service hall from the meeting rooms. There was a moment, between the scraping of chairs and the distant laughter, when he imagined a voice saying, "Can he open it?" And then a larger voice answering, "Even that filthy kid?" The words were unspoken. The echo reached him anyway, the way an insult sometimes rides on the edges of a joke. He felt the heat of being noticed in a room where being seen usually meant the wrong thing. Pity, amusement, dismissal. After the second day of failure, Mauricio's amusement hardened into a spectacle. It is one thing to lose to logic. It is another to craft drama out of someone else's indignity. He called a staff meeting and stood with the safe at the front like a judge presenting an exhibit. Cameras were allowed. A PR clip would find its way to the company's internal feed. Mauricio leaned elegantly toward performance. "If anyone in this building, anybody, can open this thing, I will give them everything inside," he announced, voice slick with challenge. He pronounced the amount with the performative excess of a man who knew numbers as armor. $100 million. The way he said it was to show that the prize was not a possibility, but a demonstration of power. People laughed. The laugh rolled across the room like a tide. It was the kind of laughter that measures distance. These people here, and that one over there, who could barely afford a clean shirt. "Even the cleaners?" someone joked. And the laughter went sharper, the kind that wants to end with a moral arrow pointing at someone faintly ridiculous. Mauricio noticed where the ripples of the joke landed. He saw faces, their tiny fear, the way people tried to hide the corners of their world. He loved the moment. It was a soft confirmation of his place. His eyes slid to the service corridor window. He saw, without intending to, a small pair of dusty sneakers pause and then continue pushing a cart. For a long second, his smile did not falter. Then he added, more dangerously genial than necessary, "Even him. If that boy can open it, all of it will be his." A silence that felt like a physical thing moved through the room. Laughter turned brittle. Eyes slid to where Mateo was sweeping with a stubborn concentration that made his small shoulders steady. His hands were honest, the nails gritty, the knuckles knobbled by work. No one expected him to step forward. The assumption lived in the room like a rule. But that evening, as night pressed against the windows and the city lights leaned in, Mateo went home and put his number packets on the small table in the one-room apartment he shared with his parents. He thought about primes the way other children thought about superheroes. Primes were stubborn friends, indivisible by anything other than themselves. He had learned, in fragments between shifts and school, that patterns often began with primes. The Fibonacci sequence, that odd, quiet progression his teacher had praised, showed up in shells and trees and stock charts. Perfect squares had a neatness, a way of folding numbers into tidy boxes. Mateo slept with a pencil in his fist, the way some people keep their hands on a steering wheel in a dream. He dreamed of the safe, of numbers arranged like faces. In his dream, numbers answered him. The next morning, he walked to work carrying the same cart and the same small dignity. Word had spread in a loop that made the head of the city feel like a theater and the service corridor feel like a backstage. Cameras had multiplied overnight. Phones now streamed the safe's presence like a live animal. Mauricio preened for the cameras, making the challenge more of a show. Close-up shots filtered through social feeds. The headline for the company's internal newsletter read like an advertisement. The hum of the office was a nervous chord. People were watching. Mateo's teacher, Professor Hernandez, had once found him looking at a math problem in a public bench and had bent his broad, patient face down to his level and said, "Numbers don't care what you look like." That simple line had lodged under Mateo's ribs and steadied him. He remembered the professor's hand tapping the chalkboard, showing how the next number in a sequence could be guessed if you knew to look for the pattern of additions or the pattern of primes. The professor had given him a small notebook with problems written in an uneven teacher's script. "Take this," he had said, pressing it into the boy's hand. "Keep thinking." When Mateo heard the words, that Mauricio would give the prize to anyone who could open the safe, something tight loosened inside him. It was not greed. It was the scent of possibility, as spare and precise as the graphite in his pencil. He had never wanted much. He wanted school books without tattered corners, a bus that arrived on time, a quiet place to think. The safe became, to his mind, less a glittering spectacle and more a problem set waiting to be solved. Problems had answers. He had practice. He told his mother in the kitchen, where the light pooled like tea. Rosa listened with the elbows of a woman who knew the weight of practical worry. She folded his words into her worry, and then, in that economy of love she had, she let them sit. "Be careful," she said simply. You know how people laugh. Carlos, who came home with pockets full of small coins and the smell of the bus, chuckled the way poor men do when surprised by a fragile hope. If you open it, keep the math in your head, he said, trying to fashion pride from something he feared might be a humiliation. Don't let the gold make your head heavy. Mateo nodded, and the house felt for a moment, held together by the small certainty of their voices. He went to bed with his notebook under his pillow and, in the dark, rehearsed the kinds of sequences he'd seen on the chalkboard. Primes ticking like a metronome, Fibonacci numbers unfolding like a secret drawing, squares forming neat arrays. He thought with the thoroughness of someone who had to make his case with the only tools he trusted, practice and attention. On the morning, he returned to the building. Cameras clustered like strange birds. Mauricio, more theatrical than before, had decided that today would be the day of spectacle. The executives lined up like a court. They offered their solutions with the arrogance of people who had never had to prove anything to survive. They tried brute math. They tried algorithmic simulation on laptops. They tried to coax the safe with force and gentle logic alike. The safe responded to none of it. Then Mauricio, bored and batting at a mood, turned to the service corridor window in the way a man scans a crowd for amusements, and he saw Mateo. A smirk slid across his face. He called him out by name, because the risk of humiliation is sharper when it is personal. "Come here, boy," Mauricio said, the voice trying for magnanimity, but landing on something cruel. Phones leaned forward. People cleared their throats as if the air itself expected a performance. "If you can open this, the 100 million will be yours." The room held its breath. Some of the laughter that had been ready before recoiled with the suddenness of anyone who has been taught to find amusement at another's expense and then notices seriousness in response. Mateo could have let the moment pass. He could have turned and walked the other way, eased himself back into the anonymity of work. But there is a law in certain people, a stubborn, quiet law, that when an insult is offered like a bet, it transforms, by the force of bearing, into a choice. Mateo stepped forward. His mother had taught him to be careful with pride, to prefer the modest dignity of work over the spectacle of show. He had no appetite for revenge. He had only, at the base of himself, a desire to answer the problem with clarity. He asked to see the safe up close. His fingers, roughened by chores and the squeeze of a pencil, hovered over the mat face and traced the tiny symbols as if recognizing old friends. The executives leaned in, half embarrassed and half delighted at the possibility of another humiliating turn. Mauricio smiled as if the boy's acceptance confirmed him. One more piece of theater. Mateo knelt in front of the safe and, without ceremony, touched the small screen. He read the inscriptions not as riddles meant to shame, but as clues arranged like a tidy curriculum. He spoke softly to himself, a habit he had developed in the quiet hours when the bus took him past the river, first primes, then Fibonacci, then perfect squares, then the logic riddle. He liked order. The safe felt like a classroom, and he, for a moment, like a student who knew his lesson. The first layer asked, simply, deceptively, for a prime. It expected numbers that would not divide evenly into smaller parts. Mateo thought of the primes he had practiced in the margins of his notebook. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. He knew there was often a key, a twist in the set that revealed the code. He noted subtle markings around the keypad, tiny scratches that suggested a sequence, and selected a prime that fit the pattern. When his finger pressed the last digit, the safe emitted a small musical chirp, clear and modest. The room flinched in unison. It was the sound of rules being acknowledged. Mauricio's mouth opened as if to scoff, and then the scoff closed into a different sound, calculation. Cameras adjusted focus. Phones clicked. The first chirp had been tiny, and the effect larger than the sound itself. Pride can hinge on a note. The second layer required the recognition of a sequence that grew by adding the two previous numbers. The Fibonacci spiral that Mateo had traced on paper until the loops looked like the shells at the bus stop. He pictured the sequence in his head, fingers counting. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13. He saw the scratches on the safe's edges aligned to the sequence like a puzzle in a margin. He pressed the numbers with the calm thoroughness of someone who practices sums by hand at night when the city turns its lights softer. The safe responded with a harmonic chime, warmer than the first. A ripple moved through the room. Mauricio's face tightened at the jaw. The third layer demanded an array, an image of squares stacked into neat boxes. It was the kind of puzzle that delights a mind that likes cleanliness. Perfect squares, the numbers that fold into perfect shapes. 1, 4, 9, 16, 25. Mateo imagined dots arranged in boxes, and he knew, as he had always known, where the neatness would land. He entered the series with the kind of certainty earned by practice. This time the safe's sound was like a small bell, a resonance that made the shoulders of the executives drop slightly as if someone had lightened a weight they pretended to ignore. The last part was a logic riddle, the sort of thing Mateo's teacher liked to present in class and watch the students' faces tick as they reasoned. It was not a question of numbers now, but of relationships. This implies that, which implies that, therefore this must be correct. He read the riddle aloud in a voice that was quieter than the hum of the fluorescent lights. It asked him to parse a few statements and deduce which one could be true. The logic had a brittle fairness. No elegance, just the relief of truth when chosen correctly. He traced the reasoning the way he traced the grocery lists his mother left on the table. He eliminated contradictions, like sweeping away crumbs, until only one consistent choice remained. He pressed it. The room held a breath like a crowd waiting for a goal in the last minute of a game. Phones tilted forward. Mauricio watched as if he were seeing his own image reflected in someone else's hand. The safe, which had been an unimpressed, inscrutable object, gave a sound that had not been heard before. A soft, long intake, like something unlocking the world's small expectation. For a beat that became viscous in its length, the only sound was that slender note and then silence. Sudden, almost holy, as if somebody had turned off all the air machines in the building. When the lid eased open, it made no show. It did not burst with confetti. It slid like a revelation that had been waiting for the right name. The room, which had been loud with its own sharpness, folded into astonishment. Mauricio's smile distended into a face that had never expected to be so surprised. Phones recorded in a flurry that sounded like a rain of marble beads. Someone whooped, then instantly regretted it. The cameras kept coming, their lenses trying to catch the small figure kneeling by the safe. Mateo did not cry out. He did not make a speech. He slid a hand, as if to steady himself, along the lip of the safe and looked inside. There was a container, a folder perhaps, weight that felt like paper and possibility. For a child who had measured his world in bus coins and kitchen light, the inside of that safe was a strange room of future choices. Mauricio stepped forward then, forced by the gravity of having promised and the gravity of being recorded. He said the words, because he had already said them and men like him are compelled to close their own loops, but they came out unshaped, as if he were reading the margin of his life for the first time. The camera records would later show his face shifting in ways that no rehearsed man likes to admit. Surprise, then a flash of calculation. He had built a fortress of status that believed money settled questions. Suddenly the answer to the test of his challenge had been given by a boy he had thought to mock. The first layer of consequence had landed like a small stone. The rest of the room pressed in, morphing the private into the public. Phones buzzed. People shared the moment with the merciless swiftness of social feeds. A single clip, shaky and close, caught Mateo's fingers brushing the folder as though to make it unobtrusive. The clip would, in hours, explode past the reaches of the building. But in that precise second, the future was still only a ripple. Mauricio's jaw worked. He cleared it and tried to translate the spectacle into the civility his public had taught him. He had, after all, promised. Mateo rose slowly. The light from the window glossed his face in a way that showed grime and resolve together. He looked at the men who had made jokes and at the cameras that had found their prey. He looked at Mauricio and simply said, "I solved it." His voice was small but steady, not triumphal, not pleading, only a clear report. For a moment Mauricio's face was an unreadable tide. The applause that rose was half disbelief and half performance. Some people clapped because they were impressed, others because rhythm refuses silence. But beneath the clapping, under the hum of copied footage and celebratory murmurs, an old, unnamed sound began to make room. The soft, persistent beating of conscience that tends to make the wealthy restlessly audit their own lives when something undeniable has been taken from them and given to someone who had earlier been made to bear their scorn. Carolina, watching from a doorway, caught Mauricio's eye and saw him falter. Don Alberto, nearby, folded his hands and watched as if he were counting something other than profit. There was a slow, almost theatrical shifting of the power dynamic in the room, and everyone felt the scale tilt. No one yet knew how far that tilt would reach. No one knew whether the tilt would end in restitution or in a clever legal avoidance. The cameras were oblivious to that. They only knew the image of a boy and a safe and the neat shock of an expectation reversed. Mateo's family, who had been following the stream from an old cell phone on the table in a cramped kitchen, leaned toward the screen like people praying on a holiday. Rosa's fingers twisted the hem of her apron. Carlos's cough, held back on the verge of a sound, made louder by the hope that trembled under it. They had taught Mateo the toughness of work and the humility of hands, and now the world had offered him, as an answer to a puzzle, a door he had never expected on his street. When the safe opened, the room did not know immediately how to narrate the moment. Mauricio, whose identity was built on being the man who decided the value of things, had been upended by a child's quiet certainty. It would be a long night, and longer days, for the company. For a man who kept his reputation like a ledger, this moment had been an unwanted debit. But in that precious held second, the narrative had not yet moved into verdicts. Cameras recorded, people whispered, the city watched. Mateo closed the small folder cautiously, as if kindness required he not let the whole world tumble at once. He looked at Mauricio, and there was no gloating in his gaze. Only the steady, unadorned look of someone who had answered a problem, the modest pride of a hand that had worked and found success. A voice from the doorway called out. Someone had already thought to place a reporter, a mic, a question, and the cameras leaned forward like birds again. For the first time since the challenge began, Mauricio's voice wavered. He moved to reclaim the moment as his own. He was practiced at the salvaging gestures of the powerful. But the gesture faltered because he was now working against an unexpected fact. A promise had been made and kept by a man who had underestimated not just a child, but the moral arithmetic that attends public actions. Outside, the city pulsed with its indifferent rhythms. Inside, for one long-held minute, the world practiced the strange economy of accountability. Someone had mocked dignity. A small person had shown brilliance, and the ledger had shifted. How it would balance was not yet decided. People would later pick sides, some cheering the boy as a symbol, some defending Mauricio's pride as a victim of the quick camera. But in that raw, private second, the only thing that mattered was the small certainty of the safe's unlocking, and the way it exposed a thread running through all the lives in that room. Money could change hands, but dignity could be offered or denied, and the cost of denying it sometimes returned in the currency of reputation. Mateo tucked the folder into his jacket as if it were an ordinary notebook. He felt the weight of eyes on his back and the warmth of the small sound that had freed itself from inside the safe. There was a strange clarity about the moment, like an arithmetic problem solved and then set down. He had solved what was before him. He had done what he knew to do. Outside the office windows, the first phone notifications began to pulse. They would multiply into a feed that would not be contained by the building's glass for long. Mauricio walked to the center of the room, his steps measured by a man who had to perform contrition and command simultaneously. He had promised. People had watched. The public, even then, hovered like a cloud of reactions ready to fall. And when he spoke, because speak he must, the words felt small in his mouth, as if he were attempting, with a language that usually commanded markets, to describe the experience of being watched while wrong. He said, with a voice that tried to shape itself into the dignity of a man who will do the right thing, "We will honor the terms." The words were out, simple as a receipt. They landed with an awkward sincerity that did not erase what had been done, but at least signaled the beginning of a consequence. Phones multiplied their lights like insects. The room shuddered with a set of sounds. The click of camera shutters, the murmur of corporate counsel who would soon speak of contracts and clauses, the small unexpected sound of someone clapping with a real surprised admiration. For Mateo, the moment was not about the number spoken, but the reality of being seen properly. Not as an object of ridicule, but as someone who could stand with his hands on an answer and be recognized for it. The small bell tones of the safe's confirmation still echoed in the air, and then, like all ripples, they began to spread. Unknown to everyone in that room, a single clip would find an account that had 1 million followers, and then another, and another. For now, though, the echo lived in the faces and the quiet registers of feeling that cross among people when an injustice is exposed and cannot be easily rebranded. Someone in the doorway, Carolina, pressed her phone to her ear and began to type, fingers moving with the careful skill of a woman who saw both human consequence and public consequence at once. Don Alberto, who had watched with the unembellished gaze of a man used to balancing books and human failings alike, folded his hands and did not look away. Mauricio's smile had not yet learned the shape of apology. It would take time. Mateo felt, in the hollow where breath meets the sternum, a mixture of relief and the old small weight of caution. He had answered the problem set that the world had set before him. He had done it with the only tools he trusted. He did not yet know what it would cost him to be visible in this way. He only knew that the safe had opened, and the room had grown quiet enough to hear the sound of hearts moving. Outside the glass, the city kept its indifferent hum. Inside, the small luminous screen of a phone showed a clip that the world would soon replay. And in that replay, a boy with dusty sneakers would be lifted into a conversation he had not asked for. The first chant of public reaction was only the beginning. The ledger of things had shifted, and now someone would begin to count the cost of that shift. Not only in money, but in reputation, in obligation, in the need for restitution that the cameras made loud, and the conscience inside certain men made louder still. For a moment the story paused on the edge of a choice. Would this be the kind of moment that changed a single life, or the kind that forced a man and a company to reckon with how they regarded the people who kept their building running? The cameras had recorded the unlocking. The rest, the viral storm, the public demands, the private reckonings, the notary's inevitable meeting, was yet to come. But in the brightness of that opened lid, something fundamental had shifted. A challenge born of mockery had become a test of character, and someone who had spent a life placing himself above others had been handed a small, undeniable mirror. If this moment has grabbed you, stay with it. What follows will not be tidy, and it will not be what you expect. The clip moved faster than anyone expected. Within an hour, the shaky video from the conference room had been picked up by an employee with an enormous follower base. Within the morning, it had become a headline. The image that repeated on screens was simple and stubborn. A small boy kneeling before a black safe, a hand on its lip, the lid easing open. The caption read, in tones that ranged from startled admiration to gleeful outrage, "The millionaire laughed at the $100 million challenge, but the poor child shocked everyone." Notifications thundered through inboxes. Internal messages at the company multiplied into urgent threads. Outside, competitors and clients who had once courted Mauricio began to call. The boardroom's buzz turned into a pressure cooker of legal counsel, PR strategists, and executives who could no longer pretend they were watching a private show. The image of the promise, a man on camera offering $100 million to anyone who can open this, had changed framing from spectacle to obligation. Words like honor, binding, and public statement began to orbit the company like moths. Mauricio, who had been fluent in controlling narratives, discovered a new sensation, being caught in someone else's framing. He paced in his office at the glass wall, watching the feeds with a kind of disbelief that didn't quite have a verb. Carolina hovered near him, the phone in her hand a small, persistent metronome. Don Alberto, normally the steady balancing figure, had stopped being merely observant and had become an ally who said the kinds of things Mauricio had not wanted to hear aloud. "You said it on camera," Don Alberto told him in the tiled hush of the conference room now thick with counsel. "People have seen it. He opened it. Public promises have weight." Mauricio had the reflex of a man who had always been able to reframe inconvenient scenes, a lawyer to spin, a clause to invoke, a charitable donation to present as goodwill rather than restitution. At first he tried the usual script: delay, consult, recontextualize. But every stall added grain to the narrative that he was avoiding something simple and necessary. Callers asked for explanations. Business partners asked if he was serious. A major client deferred a contract renewal. A charity partner suspended talks. The company's social feed, which had earlier hosted congratulatory notes about quarterly profits, filled with comments that were less forgiving. Images of the safe's small screen, the boy's hand, tagged calls for dignity and accountability. At night, the office lights stayed on long after Mauricio had left. On his side of the glass, his reflection kept company with his decision-making. He had always liked certainty, math, profit projections, the steady rise of a share graph. Now certainty had been overturned by a simple, undeniable act. He sat on the edge of his bed and found he could not be reassured by numbers anymore. The ledger in his mind began to tick in a different currency. Reputation, moral obligation, the visible proof of someone else's dignity. The public pressure was not only external. Internally, employees began to speak in ways that suggested they had been watching the company not as a machine of profit, but as a place where dignity was either tended to or trampled. Carolina received messages from colleagues who admitted, with a shame they had not always voiced, how many times they had laughed at the cleaners' jokes or made light of the service staff. Don Alberto, who had walked through the service corridors on his morning rounds for years, began to quietly push for changes in employee treatment. More transparent contracts, better sick leave, a review of wages. Those conversations, which had once been deferred to budget meetings and HR memos, now carried weight because the cameras had made the world see what had always been there. Mauricio felt his equilibrium fracture in increments. He had not imagined being held accountable in public for something he had considered a private amusement. The city's pundits debated on live feeds. Was this a stunt gone wrong? Was it a teachable moment? Influencers who had once toasted the man's success now posed uncomfortable questions. How had he become so certain of his own superior judgment that he would make a spectacle of a child? Mauricio watched himself on slower, more deliberate clips that showed the casual cruelty of his taunt. The way his lips had flirted with the humiliation registered on camera in a way his own memory hadn't prepared him for. But social pressure alone, Mauricio discovered, was a blunt instrument. It would take more than tweets and critical headlines to move the man whose life had been measured in margins. The rest came in the form of consequences. A key client asked for a meeting to discuss their contract. An investor questioned the company's moral leadership in a conference call. A young executive told Mauricio, quietly and with a bravery he would later not forget, that he could not, in good conscience, continue if the company's ethics did not change. The story piled on itself, a slow avalanche of reputation costs. Mauricio began to remember things he hadn't meant to revisit. Memory arrives unbidden when the mind is dislodged. He saw, suddenly and painfully, the outline of his own mother in a uniform, sleeves rolled, sweeping a floor in a small convent-like service area. He had been a child then, resentful of what felt like a lack of polish in his family. He had promised himself a life where numbers solved everything. The memory of her hands, not unlike Rosa's, returned with the mute force of a revelation. Dignity had been there, present in quiet labor, long before he had framed the world in balance sheets. The image cracked something that had been set as firm as stone. That internal fracture mattered. It made Mauricio reach for something that was not mere compliance. He called Don Alberto and Carolina into his office with a voice that no longer carried the swagger of public theater. "We need to fix this," he said. And for the first time in a long time, his words did not arrive wrapped in a profit motive. They carried, faltering and earnest, a willingness to make amends. The decision to meet Mateo and his family was not only a response to public pressure, it was also an admission that a man who had built his identity on control had found himself confronted by something he could not control. The truth of an action and its simple human consequence. They arranged a notary meeting to formalize what would be done. Words like transfer, irrevocable trust, and public apology were discussed with counsel in sterile rooms, but then replaced in the plan by more human items. A job offer for Rosa that respected her work rather than tokenized it. A foundation with independent oversight focused on helping gifted children in poverty. Scholarships and support for Mateo's education. Commitments to better worker conditions across the company. Not every person present in those discussions believed Mauricio's motives were pure. Some thought he was repairing his image. Some thought he was preventing a collapse. A few, like Don Alberto and Carolina, imagined a more honest transformation. A man who recognized his own failing and wanted to change. The truth was that inside Mauricio both motives lived. Fear of a battered public image sat alongside a creeping, sincere regret. Motive matters less to people who will accept a repair when it is offered. The results mattered most to those outside the glass. Mateo, Rosa, Carlos, and the many other people who kept the building functioning. The day the notary's office convened, it felt formal in an old, almost ceremonial way. Notary Ramiro Vega presided like a quiet judge of civic rituals, the room's air thick with the weight of official acts. Mauricio stepped into the space not as a magnate, but as a man who had to speak the truth in a way he had rarely practiced in public. Cameras were present. There was no pretending that the world would not watch, but the tone in the room aimed for something steadier than spectacle. Don Alberto and Carolina accompanied him. Professor Hernandez arrived with Mateo and his family. A small cluster of journalists waited, their pens poised like instruments of consequence. There were words that needed to be said. Mauricio, who had once used phrases to build distance, now used them to narrow the gap between what had been done and what he intended to do. He apologized, not brusquely, not theatrically, but with a stuttering sincerity that bore the marks of a man who had been taught to command boards, rather than to ask forgiveness. He acknowledged the mockery and the harm it had caused. He acknowledged the ledger in a different currency, the way one's public words can wound. When he spoke of transferring the $100 million into an educational trust for Mateo and for a foundation to support other gifted children, the words landed as a formal act, and also as a symbol of a material change. Notario Ramiro Vega read the formalities slowly and with gravity. Mauricio signed documents whose ink held both legal weight and moral meaning. The transfer was structured in a way the company's counsel could explain in broad strokes. Funds placed in an irrevocable trust and an independent foundation with oversight to ensure the money would be used for educational scholarships, community programs, and workforce dignity initiatives. The language was intentionally plain so that it could be understood not only by board members and lawyers, but by families like Mateo's. Carolina arranged for Rosa to be offered a dignified, stable position as the foundation's outreach coordinator. Don Alberto insisted on oversight measures that would prevent the money from being used merely as PR veneer. Mateo watched the proceedings with the clarity he carried like a small lamp. He did not smile with triumph. He placed his hands calmly in his lap and listened as Mauricio spoke. When asked why he had accepted the funds rather than refusing, Mateo answered in a voice that was steady and spare. "It is not about taking money for myself. It is about opening doors." There was no vengeful gloating in him, only a careful assessment of what the door could mean, not merely for him but for the children he knew on his street who were talented but unseen. Rosa stood beside him, hands worked into a shape of composed emotion. When Mauricio offered her the job, his voice was both hesitant and earnest. "I want this to be more than a handed wallet," he said. "I want a role that honors what you do, really honors it." Her eyes searched his face, seeking not only his words, but the sincerity behind them. She accepted with a reserved grace, one that did not dissolve the cost of earlier humiliation, but recognized the chance for tangible change. Carlos, who had watched the videos with a mixture of hope and disbelief, found a way to laugh when he described how the bus driver would now wave at him with a different look. He still coughed sometimes, but the family's nights were steadier now. A small operation to repair his breathing was arranged with the assistance of the foundation's initial support, not as a miracle, but as what happens when resources align with need. The public watched the notary's ceremony and then dissected it. There were cynics who called Mauricio's action a PR play. There were advocates who, even while skeptical, acknowledged the concrete benefits. The foundation's charter, however, included independent trustees, academic liaisons like Professor Hernandez, and community representatives who would ensure that decisions were not simply made behind closed corporate doors. That structure mattered because it turned a private redemption into a public instrument designed to last beyond the headlines. The days after the notary were a study in how a single event ripples outward. Photographs of Mauricio signing the trust document circulated alongside images of Mateo receiving acceptance letters from a technical institute and a scholarship program. Rosa began working in the foundation's outreach office, creating a program that invited school teachers and community leaders to nominate children who showed promise but lacked means. A process that was, from its first iteration, dignified and thoughtful. Within the company, Mauricio began to implement changes that were neither flashy nor cinematic, but practical. Don Alberto oversaw a review of employee contracts. Sick leave policies were improved. Training programs were expanded so that entry-level staff could pursue certifications and leadership tracks. Wages were adjusted where they had been unjustly low. Those changes did not erase the earlier mockery, but they altered the daily lives of many people in the building and sent a message that the institution itself was being asked to match the values it would now publicly endorse. As weeks turned into months, the foundation, named Foundation Dignity by a community vote that included the Santillana corporate board and neighborhood representatives, began to take shape. It established a fellowship for promising children that covered tuition, mentorship, and a living stipend for families, recognizing that talent needed not only instruction, but also the removal of logistical obstacles. Scholarships had clear pathways, technical programs, internships with partner companies, including Mauricio's, but under strict governance to avoid conflicts, and mentorships with educators like Professor Hernandez. An independent advisory council ensured selections were transparent and merit-based. The foundation also funded a small clinic partnership that helped families with practical needs, transportation to medical appointments, tutoring spaces after school, and a modest fund for families facing immediate crises. The intention was to treat the child as a person inside a web of supports, not as a solitary figure who would be uplifted by money alone. The language of restoration was troubling to some, because it could imply that money alone could repair structural inequality. Foundation Dignity, however, aimed to be a sustained effort that acknowledged complexity. Structural change required time, patience, and institutional accountability. Mateo's life changed not only in material terms, but in how he oriented himself to possibility. He began an advanced program at a national technical institute, where his curiosity was nurtured by teachers who saw him as a student to be taught, not a symbol to be showcased. He learned programming and complex problem-solving, subjects that made his mind light up the way certain numbers always had. He also began to mentor younger children in the community, sitting with them at the very park where he had once counted primes because he couldn't sleep. "Numbers don't care what you look like," he would tell them, echoing Professor Hernandez's line with the gentle conviction of someone who had seen it proven. The Foundation's first year yielded tangible outcomes that were modest in immediate scale, but significant in meaning. Dozens of scholarships were awarded. Several children from low-income neighborhoods were placed in advanced courses. Others were given small stipends that made attendance viable. The company instituted a policy of hiring locally for certain roles and launched training programs that allowed service staff to move into technical and administrative positions. These were the kinds of changes that do not make overnight headlines, but they change daily life. Mauricio's transformation did not happen in a single moment. He made public speeches that were halting at first, then gradually more composed, in which he admitted his earlier blind spots and urged the public to look beyond spectacle. He met with community groups, took part in panels about corporate responsibility, and slowly, very slowly, began to be seen not simply as the proprietor of a vast company, but as someone who had been forced to reconcile his actions with the moral consequences they carried. There was skepticism. Some people refused to accept his apology. They reminded the world that public contrition does not erase prior harm. Mauricio, for his part, accepted that redemption was work, not a press release. He worked with Don Alberto and Carolina to open the company's governance to greater scrutiny and to decouple the Foundation's board from purely corporate control. He visited the neighborhoods where his employees lived, not as a man handing out alms, but as someone listening, and he allowed himself to be told uncomfortable truths by people he had once overlooked. A year after the safe had first been placed on the conference table, the Foundation held an inaugural event. It was simple. No champagne flutes, no corporate banners without community logos. The space was filled with children in uniforms, parents who had traveled from neighborhoods a man's wealth had rarely touched, educators, and a few staff from Mauricio's company who had helped build the programs. Mateo stood at a modest podium, his voice steady, and spoke not as a beneficiary but as a representative of something larger, a belief that talent deserved to be found and given room to grow. "We are not here because someone felt charitable," Mateo said. "We are here because someone promised, and that promise changed what could happen. But a promise means little unless we make doors and keep them open." His words were measured, without the syrup of platitude. He thanked his parents, his teacher, and the people who had helped. He also pointedly included the broader community, teachers who had nominated children, the neighbors who had watched kids play in empty lots, and the fellow students who tutored after class. Mauricio listened from the back of the hall. When it was his turn to speak, he did not offer grand pronouncements. He apologized again, briefly, and committed to ongoing funding but also to changes in workplace policies. "Dignity has a price," he said, "and it is not only in dollars. It is in how we treat each other every day." The line was not perfect. It carried the awkwardness of a man still learning to speak from a different script. But it carried weight because he had been through the reckoning and because the Foundation's independent trustees were already at work. The numbers the Foundation published a year later were modest but meaningful. Scholarships awarded, internships created, a percentage of company hires from local communities increased, a measurable improvement in certain staff benefits. Those were not miracles. They were results of work and resources applied to a problem that had long been ignored. The ripple effect included things the press rarely counted: a parent who could now afford a bus to take a child to an extra class, a cleaner who had been sponsored for a certification and now supervised a team, a teenage intern who had learned how to code and then was hired by a partner organization. One quiet afternoon, after the foundational ceremonies and the media cycles had mellowed from frenzy to steady reporting, Mauricio found himself walking down a service corridor. The same corridor where he had once offered a cruel bet now felt different under the lights. He moved without the entourage that used to cushion him. Instead, he carried a small cup of coffee and the awkward humility of someone still getting used to being forgiven. He passed the room where Mateo had once tucked number scraps into his shirt and saw, at the end of the corridor, a bulletin board filled with student accomplishments, awards, acceptance letters, notes of thanks. He paused, reading names and recognizing faces. Mateo, on his way back from a mentoring session, saw Mauricio and nodded. There was no grand embrace, no contrived scene. Instead, two people who had been on different sides of a sharp moment met in a hallway that had once been the theater of humiliation. Mauricio, who had been taught to control outcomes, found himself saying something small but sincere. "Thank you for showing me." Mateo looked up, thoughtful, and answered, "Thank you for deciding to help others after." There was an exchange of glances that carried more than closed accounts. It carried a possibility that things could shift if people were willing to change their habits. Not everyone was satisfied. Some in the public insisted the moment was insufficient. They reminded others that one person's restitution does not fix a system. Those critics pushed the foundation and the company to be more transparent, to show not only money but also measurable policy changes. That pressure mattered. It kept the conversation from turning into a feel-good parable that washed away its own complexities. The foundation's board published regular reports. The company's HR reforms were audited by independent consultants and published in summary form. These steps were clunky and imperfect, but they signaled an ongoing commitment rather than a singular theatrical act. Back in the neighborhood, people noticed quieter shifts. More children enrolled in after-school tutoring, a small lab at the local institute where students could practice coding, a bursary that covered uniforms and transport. Rosa, now an outreach coordinator, became a bridge between the foundation and the community. She had a knack for listening and for translating bureaucratic language into practical steps. And in doing so, she earned a level of respect she never needed to win for herself, but that she treasured for what it gave her children. Carlos, whose cough had been a persistent shadow, woke one morning after a procedure supported in part by the foundation and walked to the bus stop with a steadier step. He still sold candy, but now he did so with the knowledge that his family had options. The most delicate change, perhaps, was not in the policies or the programs, but in the way dignity became a shared grammar. The company's service staff ate lunches not in a back room, but at communal tables. Their ideas for workplace improvements were solicited in formal forums. Students like Mateo were invited to speak at company events not as props, but as contributors. What had been performed as spectacle had slowly been rendered into sustained practices that put actual resources and structural attention behind a promise. Months later, a journalist asked Mauricio whether the $100 million had changed him. It was a clumsy question that tried to conflate monetary transfer with moral metamorphosis. Mauricio took a beat and replied in a way that avoided slogans. "It didn't change me in a day. It forced me to ask difficult questions and then to answer them. The money is a tool. What matters is what we build with it." He credited Don Alberto, Carolina, and others who had kept pressing the company to follow through. The humility in his voice was nascent and not always consistent, but it was there. Mateo's trajectory continued to be guided not only by financial support, but by mentorship and a community that now recognized his gifts. He stayed grounded in the everyday things that anchored him: the smell of lemon cleaner, the sound of public buses, the small joys of counting numbers with a friend. He tutored younger children on Saturdays, sometimes under the dim light of a community center, sometimes in the shadow of the very corporate building where his life had briefly been made theater. He insisted on teaching with patience, reinforcing the dignity of learning rather than treating it as an instrument for social climbing. At the Foundation's first annual review, Mateo spoke again. This time he addressed not only the people who had helped him, but also other children listening online. "The safe was a problem," he said, "and problems have answers if you look for the pattern. But solving a problem isn't enough if the people who are good at solving things don't help set the table for those who weren't invited." He urged the audience to find ways to open doors for others, not to wait for spectacles in conference rooms. The final scene, 1 year on from the laugh that set the story in motion, was not meant to be tidy. There were continuities and tensions. Mauricio still misstepped sometimes. The foundation still had more needs than money, and the problems of systemic poverty and lack of access were not erased by good intentions. But there were also tangible lines of change: scholarship numbers, policy adjustments, jobs that paid more and carried pathways to advancement. The city's conversation had shifted, at least locally, toward the dignity of labor and the responsibility of institutions to protect it. On a late afternoon that carried the gentle exhaustion of a day that had fulfilled many small obligations, Mateo and Mauricio stood together near a small mural painted by neighborhood children. It showed a staircase leading from a humble house to a classroom at the top, painted in bright colors. Children's names were scrawled along the steps. Mateo touched the paint as if testing its texture. Mauricio watched him, and they shared a look that had moved beyond the original spectacle. "I never thought numbers would lead to this," Mauricio said after a moment, the sentence both literal and metaphorical. Mateo smiled without making the gesture grand. "Numbers are patient," he replied. "They let you find them if you look carefully." Mauricio nodded, then hesitated and said, "I called you into my office thinking I could make a show. I didn't know I'd be shown something." "That's all right," Mateo said simply. "What matters now is what you do with what you saw." Mauricio considered that, and something in him answered with motion. Commitments kept, policy changes enforced, a foundation that would not be simply a billboard, but a working mechanism. The earlier arrogance had been replaced by a steadier, more vulnerable leadership that accepted scrutiny and asked for help. As the evening folded into a quiet dusk, people walked past the mural, and the center lights came on for the tutoring rooms. A group of children practiced multiplication tables. A college student tutored them and paused to high-five Mateo for a problem solved. Rosa and Carlos walked hand in hand down the street, their steps lighter than the year before. Don Alberto wrote a note and filed it in the foundation's records. Carolina devised a plan to broaden the mentorship program. None of them thought the work was done. They only knew that a single act, a promise, an insult, a surprise answer, had become a lever for change. If this story asks anything of you as a viewer, it is this. Notice who we make invisible and find ways to change the script. Share the story not because it makes for a tidy ending, but because it points to a practice, that of recognizing dignity and committing resources to support it, that can be lived in many small ways beyond headlines. If this resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that dignity matters. In the description below, you'll find a link to organizations working to identify and support gifted children from low-income backgrounds, places where your attention or your help can turn a single solved problem into long-term opportunity.